we saw dozens and dozens of new anti-protest policies introduced in the wake of January 6th. But I think that it would really be a false equivalency to say that those, the Capitol insurrection and then the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests are one and the same. From my research, really, we only have seen one bill, and that is out of Connecticut, that would explicitly take on criminalizing certain activities like taking papers from a state legislature or from chambers. So really that means that the playbook has been the same as it's been since 2017 for state legislators to introduce policies that really roll back our rights, whether it's, creating greater penalties, as Ellie says, or creating new types of penalties, not just steeper ones. These are the types of policies that aren't necessarily in response to January 6th, but in response to progressive racial justice movements.
Is anyone raising the fact that many of these same states allow protesters to carry guns? I mean, isn't that a bit hypocritical?
Well, that's one of the main progressive talking points now. Many people have kind of tried to, shine a light on that. And if you think back to our anti-lockdown protesters in Michigan who stormed their state capitol armed with guns, our former president, Donald Trump, said they were very fine people, all the while turning and looking at George Floyd protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, calling them thugs. And so I think there's this very clear animus that is viewpoint specific, that if you have a certain message, you will more likely be seen as somehow criminal. And we're trying to undo that misconception.
Let's talk about the proposed bill in Minnesota. This is, of course, where George Floyd was killed and where many protests were held after that. Nora, tell us about the bill that's proposed in Minnesota.
Well, there are so many bills in Minnesota, and it's really been a hotspot state for many anti-protest policies, from the critical infrastructure types of proposals that would make someone, near a critical infrastructure site also criminal, highway obstruction bills. Specifically, though, new pending legislation would increase costs for protesters, and it would make obstructing a highway or interfering with traffic vehicles new and enhanced penalties.
And so the Republicans who are proposing and in many cases passing these laws, what are they saying to justify this?
Well, as we've seen, Governor DeSantis mentioned many of these bills are supposed to enhance public safety, to really create a space where speech can thrive. Governor DeSantis said specifically that we needed to protect against these agitators bent on sowing disorder and causing mayhem in our cities. Other legislators have been quick to also say that we need to protect our citizens. We need to rally together to make sure that these riots aren't happening. But when we look at the numbers, when we look at what happened this past summer, our friends like ACLED, the Armed Conflict Centers, have explicitly said that 93% of the protests last summer were actually peaceful. So we're really kind of legislating and trying to correct a problem that doesn't exist.
And Ellie, where do you see what is the specific groups and the specific political ideologies that are being targeted here? I mean, what evidence do we have that this is really about Black Lives Matter and not other kinds of protests?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. I think we've repeatedly seen lawmakers seek to silence specific protest movements instead of engaging with the concerns that have motivated people to turn out. And with this wave of bills, I mean, it's no exception. Lawmakers have made very clear that they're responding to last summer's protests against systemic racism. We know this from the statements by lawmakers themselves, which often conflate last summer's, as Nora points out, overwhelmingly peaceful protests with looting and violence. And then the text of the bills, the fact that they're targeting street protests, they're raising penalties for blocking traffic, they're making it easier for people to hit protesters with their cars, and targeting large and quote unquote disorderly protests.
I still can't get over the hitting people with their cars. I mean, has there been pushback even? I mean, I would expect Republican voters to be a little wary of that one.
They're
Are we seeing
brainwashed
any
Nazis.
pushback
Have you talked to a
coming from
Republican
other
voter?
than the
They're
progressive camp on that?
brainwashed Nazis.
I mean, you would hope to see pushback from all sides of the political spectrum, because these are proposals
That's not
that
a
would
side of the
threaten
political spectrum.
a right
It's
that's enjoyed
fascism.
by all Americans.
They don't care about anything.
This is not purely a right and a freedom that enjoyed by protesters on the left. So whether it's or reopen protesters or anti-abortion protesters, I mean, they're exercising the same right
except arrest
under threat
Trumpers.
now.
You don't have to change any
Okay,
laws.
we'll
Just
be right
arrest
back. We're going to take a
Trumpers
quick
for
break. This
terrorism.
is The Takeaway.
All you gotta do is arrest Trumpers for terrorism.